friends, and welcome back to my channel. September has just begun, so I figured it would be a good time to talk about the books I read in July and August. And to keep this simple, since there are a lot of books for me to get through, I'm not going to be giving in-depth synopses of each of these books. Some of them I may have less to say than others. Probably I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the books that I disliked and talk a little bit more about the books I really loved from the past 2 months, since it's kind of a mixed bag. So I have a lot of books to cover, so let's just jump right in. The first book I read in July was Half-Broke Horses by Jeanette Walls. So this is a true life novel, which essentially means it is a novelization of Jeanette Walls' grandmother's life. It is her maternal grandmother, and she speaks about her life from her own perspective as she grows up, meets Walls's grandfather, and has Walls's mother, and she talks a little bit about the relationship between her mother and her father as they were, young teenagers through her grandmother's eyes. If that makes any sense at all, I feel like I'm doing a bad job explaining that. But it is really interesting, especially if you've already read or watched The Glass Castle, to get this perspective of Walls's mother and father in the early days of their relationship, and just hear a really interesting story of a very unique and gritty individual like her grandmother. So just a very interesting book overall, and I ended up rating it 3 stars because it wasn't like a standout book in my opinion. I think that her other book is better. I do think there were points in this book that felt a little bit dry and that kind of dragged a little bit. So it kind of was a middle of the road book for me, but really fun to read this as a buddy read. I read this with my best friend, and we had both read The Glass Castle previously and watched the movie together, so this was kind of a fun extension of that. So yeah, I did think that it was well done and interesting, just not like a #1 favorite. Okay, the next book I read was Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh, and I gave this one 2 stars. I found it to be quite disappointing. I don't know what I had in mind going into it. I was recommended this book by somebody from book club. This one just didn't hit home with me. I think that part of it has to do with the fact that I really don't like historical fiction, and given that this is a historical novel, it just did not connect with me. I think that anytime there's like horror that is historical or kind of a weird book that's historical, it doesn't click with me as well as some of the books set in the present or in the recent past rather than like medieval times. I was expecting weird cannibal horror, and what I got just did not live up to my expectations. It was really boring. I don't even remember a lot of what happened in the book. It was only like a 5-hour audiobook, and I struggled to get through it. It was sort of one that I ended up having on like in the background, just trying to finish it, which is kind of dumb. I should have probably just DNF'd it at that point. Me being stubborn, I decided not to DNF it and just pushed through and regretted it. It was not my favorite. But me being me, I also can't really give things 1 star unless it is just abysmal writing, and I don't think that this one was that bad objectively. I just was very disappointed and bored. Pivoting to another fantastic book, I read We Love You Bunny by Mona Awad. This was an ARC, which was really awesome. A friend of mine from book club gave me an ARC to read, lent it to me, and she was sort of passing it around to people in our book club. So yeah, as of this video, the book still is not out yet, so I won't give any major spoilers or anything like that, but I was very impressed with this book. I really like Bunny, but to be honest, I think I liked this one more than Bunny. There were some really interesting like Frankenstein's monster type conversations, and it was interesting to hear from one of the Bunny boys' perspectives. That's all I'll say about that. But I really, really liked it, and I gave it 5 stars, whereas I gave Bunny 4 stars the first time I read it. So I do think that this is a really, really fantastic book, and I'm really happy that I got to read the ARC. I feel like that's one of the only ARCs that I've ever read ahead of when it's actually published. So that's really fun. So I really, really liked that book and gave it 5 stars. Okay, next up, I read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This was sort of on like the shame part of my TBR for a long time because I had read The Testaments and watched the show, but hadn't actually read this. And after I basically like binged all the way back through all of The Handmaid's Tale after the last season finished. I just needed more Handmaid's Tale content. So I read the Testaments and then I read this one. I mean, I'm not saying anything new when I say that this book is phenomenal. Obviously, it's a modern classic. It is a piece of fiction that will hopefully go on to be a classic in perpetuity if it doesn't get removed from shelves ever. But yeah, it is a really fantastic example of dystopian literature and really, really interesting, like reading it in comparison with the show. The show takes this and runs with it and does like so much more in terms of like expanding on the story, which I really love. I think that the show is really, really well done, and it makes sense with the character, but I will say that they do take quite a bit of liberties. I mean, June in this book, if her name actually is June, is not that kind of person. She's kind of not really rebellious. She is just trying to survive, and like, I guess that makes sense for June's character in the show for season 1, but this is basically like season 1, and then from there they really just expand on the story. So all in all, I had a really, really great time reading this, especially kind of nitpicking the similarities and differences between the characters in the show and the book. So yeah, I was quite happy with this. I have a copy of this and the spine is cracked because my mom read it, but I listened to the audiobook and I think that the audiobook was a really good way to go for this one. I think it's kind of hard to get your hands on an English version of the audiobook for some reason, at least for me, with like my library system and such, but I finally got my hands on a copy of the audiobook and the narrator was great. So definitely highly recommend doing it that way and just generally reading this book. It was a 5-star read. Okay, next up, I read A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. Now, this was sort of a random out of left field type of book. I read it at my aunt's recommendation. She's an English teacher and she knows a lot about young adult literature, so she recommended this book to me, and I had seen it like floating around BookTube years ago. I was shocked at how much I loved this and how much it affected me emotionally. It's pretty short, it has pictures, it's a YA story, and it kind of reads like a children's fairy tale, and I bawled my eyes out at the end of reading this book. I was literally like sitting on the couch next to my husband, who was also reading something at the time. I closed the book, I'm weeping, and he's just like, what is wrong with you right now? And I'm like, you need to read this book. And he's like, I don't think I want to. So that being said, I don't know why this book hit me so hard. I think it's just really beautifully written and the characters are well thought out, and I just really sympathized and empathized with the main character. I also loved the monster and the idea of the monster and the fact that it was a yew tree and all the history there. I just think that it was really beautifully done and very moving and touching. And yeah, I wouldn't have expected to love it as much as I did, but I gave it 5 stars. Okay, moving right along in the wrap up. The next book I read in July was The Unworthy by Augustina Bastarrica. I read this for a TBR takedown video and I really liked it. I immediately bought her other books after I read Tender as the Flesh, and this is the newest one. It is very different in themes and premise to Tender as the Flesh. This one focuses more on cult activity and religious fanaticism, as well as like the climate crisis. So there's some, I guess, similar themes in terms of like just critiquing our modern society to Tender as the Flesh, but it's critiquing in a different way and critiquing different issues. I liked that we had a female narrator in this one as opposed to in Tender as the Flesh. However, I do really like that narrator anyway, but it was interesting to hear Bastarrica write a female character first person. And like I said, I spoke more in depth about this in my TBR takedown video, but I ended up giving it 4 stars and thought it was really well done, though it's not a #1 favorite in the way that Tender as the Flesh was. So yeah, that is The Unworthy. Okay, so next up, I finally finished Disability Intimacy, put together by Alice Wong and by a lot of different authors as well. This is a collection of essays and works about intimacy and disability, and that takes many different forms, from sex, relationships, friendships, maternal love and intimacy. There's a lot of different things covered in this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars. It took me several months to get through it. I did feel like it was kind of a hard read in that there were some essays that I didn't like as much, and it felt a little bit disjointed, in some ways also repetitive. It's kind of hard to describe. I think that the majority of the essays were really, really interesting, and all of them had, you know, unique value and insight on disability and intimacy. I just don't think that every single one hit home for me or was as interesting to me personally. So I gave it 3 stars, like I said, because I feel like in these type of situations where it's a collection, whether that's a short story collection, essay collection, poetry collection, anything like that, it's not like a one unified thing, if that makes sense. So like when I'm reading a novel, I'm thinking about the overall experience of the one unit, the one story. Whereas when I'm reading these things that have lots of different elements and lots of different stories or essays involved, it's harder to rate them, 1, and 2, a lot of times I don't like every single one that is presented in a collection. So again, in this case, 3 stars felt appropriate because there were just as many essays I really liked as essays I didn't like. Okay, coming in hot with another 3-star read, we have Catalina by Carla Conejo Villavicencio, I think. I read this one for book club recently, so it was the July book club book. I didn't love it. I think that it was relatively interesting. I think that the character was interesting in that she is trying to live her best life, and she knows what she wants, and she's unapologetic in a lot of ways, and I think that she was an interesting character. The combination of her character and the campus novel kind of setting, I did think that it was interesting and at times enjoyable, but I really just, at this point, don't even remember very much about the book. I just didn't find it to be super memorable, and when I read it initially, I didn't overly connect to the character or the insights in the story. So yeah, it was just sort of a mid book for me, and I read it for the sake of the book club, but it wasn't my favorite. I feel like this is kind of a downer part of the video. Honestly, I feel like in July and August, there were quite a few low-rated reads as opposed to the past couple of months. May and June were really good reading months, whereas these past 2 have been more of a mixed bag. There have been some good ones, but there have also been some doozies. So speaking of another doozy, we have Waiting for Ted by Mariek Big. I had this book on my TBR, and I was interested in it for quite a long time. I recently purchased it, but it had been on my radar for years, and I think I just ignored what Goodreads had to say about it before, or just didn't think too hard about it, but just bought it because it had been on my TBR for so long, and unfortunately it was not for me. Again, I read this in a TBR takedown video, so more information about it there, but I just found it to be super disappointing. I think that the characters were not well crafted or put together. It didn't really get as weird as I hoped it did, and the kind of weird ending just felt really out of pocket and just kind of random, thrown together for the sake of a twist. So I just really did not like this one at all. Again, I find it hard to give books 1 star because I don't think that this is like the worst book that's ever been written, but I think that the writing is relatively poor. I don't think that this was a really well-written book, unfortunately. So not my favorite by any stretch of the imagination. Next up, I read Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. So this was a book that had been highly recommended to me many times as a weird woman book, a sapphic book. I was expecting it to be really weird, and I just don't know if it got weird in the way that I was hoping it would. Without going into too much detail about the premise, I just really expected that it was going to go further into the body horror aspect, and the story sort of faded into the background for me. And okay, so this is a good time to bring up the point of I have been struggling in the past couple of months with audiobooks and feeling connected to audiobooks when I read them. There are some books in here that I physically read but that I also didn't really like, and some audiobooks that I really liked. So maybe I just was reading books that I wasn't happy with. But I felt like it became really hard to focus on audiobooks and to really glean information from an audiobook. I felt like I left the book just not really knowing what had happened, and I think this one suffered from that a little bit because I have a hard time articulating even what I didn't like about it. I also think that me reading the volume of books that I have been reading, it makes it hard for me to remember individual details from individual books, character names, specific plot points, etc., unless it's like a favorite book that I've ever read. So all that to say, I don't think that this book is objectively bad. I gave it 3 stars. I found it to be kind of mid. I don't know that that judgment is totally, objective by any means. But I also don't know that that judgment is unfounded, if that makes sense. So take that with a grain of salt, because I was going through a little bit of a focusing a slump, reading slump, whatever you want to call it. I was having a hard time focusing on audiobooks, so it could just be a me thing if this is like a favorite book of yours. But yeah, not a favorite of mine. But I do have a water themed read that was up my alley that I did listen to on audiobook originally, and that is Chlorine by Jade Song. I'm obsessed with this book. I think that it is a fantastic example of girlhood horror. The idea of your body being a source of horror as you are growing up and becoming a woman, so to speak. I thought that was a really interesting thing to explore, and also her identity as an immigrant and her relationship with her parents, and this desire to always be better and to do more to finally gain the approval of her parents. It was all just really well done and really interesting, and wow, some serious body horror, some serious gross moments in this book, but also some funny moments and some lighthearted kind of comedic relief, with kind of a like air of creepiness or weirdness associated, yes, but like there was comedy and there was kind of this awkwardness of youth and becoming a young adult. All of that was tied up into this book, and I just think that it was done so perfectly that I ended up going out and buying a copy so that I could come back to it and annotate it and enjoy it again. I do think that the audiobook for this was fantastic, but when I read a book that I love this much, I always want to own a copy so that I can come back to it later. So yeah, this was a good break from those kind of not so great reads that I had throughout the month. I was really, really happy to finally have read something that I really loved. It was super weird and gross, and it was amazing. Okay, moving right along, we have Astral Season, Beastly Season by Tahi Saite, I think. This one was also disappointing, unfortunately. Spoiler alert, 2 stars. I did read this for TBR Takedown as well, so I'm just gonna keep directing you to that if you want like more in-depth thoughts on these books. I just was quite disappointed by this. I found the writing style to be really clunky. That or the translation. Honestly, the translation was also, might have been the culprit. The only redeeming quality was the second part of this book that was a little bit more believable and way less clunky feeling. But yeah, I had a hard time finishing this one, and this one had also been on my TBR, just like Waiting for Ted. It had been on my TBR for quite some time, and I finally purchased it because it was hard to get a hold of. And yeah, I just don't think it was for me. Okay, we're making our way through. Next up, we have Acts of Service by Lillian Fishman. This was one that I read for the purpose of some of my like weird women recommendation things that I have been working on, mostly on Instagram. Shout out to my Bookstagram account. This book is mostly about sex and polyamory and relationships, and dives into those subjects with a lot of detail. This was another 3-star read, and like I said before, I've been rating things 3 stars pretty frequently because it just feels like a lot of books have been mid lately, whether that's me or the book, but I did feel like this one was interesting, and I think that the topics covered were interesting and worth exploring. However, I just don't know that it was my favorite exploration of sex and romantic relationships that I've read in a book. I did leave it feeling kind of meh and kind of unsatisfied completely with the trajectory of the novel overall. So yeah, it was fine. It was okay, you know, not anything to write home about. And yeah, now coming away from it, having read it over a month ago, I don't remember much about it. I couldn't tell you character names, and that indicates to me that it was not super great. So a little bit disappointing for that one, but I wasn't really expecting anything crazy, so I still am glad that I read it. Okay, next up we have a book that I did really like, and that is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. I read this at a friend's recommendation, and wow, I really, really liked this. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't like an all-time favorite, but I do think about it regularly, so it may be worth bumping it up to 5 stars. This is another great example of girlhood horror. It also has to do with immigrant families, and there's a really interesting family dynamic at play where her father leaves and her mother ends up dating a white man, and it's very interesting in terms of that dynamic and how that affects the main character's life and her eventual cannibalistic tendencies. So yes, this is another cannibal book, and the cannibal books have not been disappointing lately. It's been super fun to read all these books in this kind of niche weird woman category. I'm a little bit obsessed, but I had a great time with it. I think that it's really well done. Like I said, it was a really good example of girlhood horror, speaking about the different traumas that girls endure in young adulthood and how those things kind of fester and turn into horrors. I think that's a really interesting exploration right now in literature. So yeah, I really, really liked this one. Okay, we're down to 2 books left in July. The first one of those is The Guest Cat by Takashi Haride. I read this with a friend of mine, and it was such a sweet read. There are parts of it that are a little bit sad, so be warned if you're planning on picking that up if you're a cat lover. However, it is such a sweet exploration of the relationship that blossoms between humans and cats, and this kind of care that they give each other. It follows a couple, and they meet a cat in their neighborhood, and they become friends and care for this cat, and it's very, very sweet. It has a lot of that like traditionally Japanese coziness that you see in a lot of Japanese translated novels. It is sparse, it's really thoughtfully and beautifully written. So this was a very quick read, but I really liked it, and I think that it's very, very sweet and cozy. So yeah, I was pretty happy with this. I gave it 4 stars. And then lastly, this was the book that I read on the plane and headed to New York. It was the last book I read in July, and that is Sky Daddy by Kate Folk. This book is super, super weird, and I've been warned not to read it on the plane, and I did anyway, and honestly, it was kind of amazing. This is about a woman who is attracted to planes and wants to marry a plane, and it is about all of the escapades that she has in order to do so. It's really weird. It is very trippy, and the character is quite strange and unlikable at times, to say the least. But it was so fun to read this on a plane because I'm just sitting there like reading about the most unhinged stuff ever, just casually next to someone who is sleeping on the plane. So it was just really funny in that way. But I'm really glad that I read this kind of in one sitting in a way. It's a longer book, so there's no way I would have read this like in a day if I was just at home. But since I had literally nothing else to do, but because I had like a really, really long travel day, I read this before I got on the plane on the first flight, in between flights on the second flight, and by that point I had completely finished it. So it went super fast. It's also like a pretty fast moving novel. So yeah, I just like dedicated the entire day to reading this, and it was kind of like a fever dream. Like I think that being in an airport is already kind of like a liminal space, and there's like a weirdness associated, but reading this whole thing in the airport and in a plane, it just was such a vibe. I don't know how else to describe it. Like I said, people warned me not to read this on a plane, or said I was brave for doing so, and like fair. I don't know that it would be for everybody to read on a plane, but I had such a fun time experiencing this in that kind of weird in-between state that is traveling. So that was the last book that I read in July. Okay, my camera died, but let's jump into my August reads. So I started August kind of simply with a couple of ebooks since I was traveling. So I started with Simplicity by Maddie Lubchansky, I think. This was a graphic novel and it had just come out. I just got really lucky in that there was like no wait time on Libby, and I just was able to snag it and read it. I ended up reading it on my phone since I don't have a color e-reader, and I wanted to like experience the full experience of reading a graphic novel in color. So I read it on my phone, which definitely not the best move for like normal ebooks, but for a graphic novel, it was totally fine. So I liked that this one was sort of a culty vibe. It's futuristic, but also about a cult in upstate New York, kind of in the backwoods. And the combination of the futuristic stuff and the like culty kind of hippie vibes was really interesting. I don't know where I even saw this. It just sort of came to my attention randomly, and I almost purchased it, but then I thought, like, am I actually going to come back to this? And luckily it was available on Libby, so I just went ahead and did that. I gave it 4 stars. I thought that the concept was really interesting. I've never seen any book like that, and I thought that it was interesting to explore it from the kind of graphic novel stylistic perspective and lens. I thought it was really well done. It just wasn't like a #1 favorite, but that kind of sparked an interest in reading some more graphic novels for me, which I haven't read at all this year. So it was kind of fun to step into that world a little bit and to get back into that. I haven't read them in a while, like I said, so that was pretty fun. And then I followed it up with an ebook, and this had been on my radar since the beginning of the year, and it just had come out. It was Television for Women by Danet Brown. And oh my God, I was so pissed off reading this. It started really well. It was kind of funny. There was some weird humor associated. It's a weird woman book about a mom who is dealing with what's probably postpartum depression, psychosis, that kind of thing. And she's struggling to adjust to motherhood, and like, fair girl, I totally get that. But she ends up being a really unhinged in that she does something to her cat, and I will not go into super detail with that, but the cat situation really ruined this book for me. Like I said, I was empathizing with her. I was understanding her perspective. I was seeing how she was struggling, and I was like, girl, I get it. But nothing will ever warrant hurting an animal, and I don't care how messed up she was. There were other ways to have handled that. So just from a perspective of like the author, not even the character, like, why would you write that? Why would you do that? I was just very angry and very unhappy with that trajectory of the book. And from there, the whole rest of the book was completely sullied. I gave it 2 stars. I almost gave it 1 star because of that. But again, I don't really give books 1 star unless it's really, really bad writing. I think that it was well written. I think it was interesting. I think that there was humor in it that I liked. So yeah, still a 2-star read, but I originally was gonna give this like 4 stars and knocked it down 2 whole stars because I could not handle how the cat was treated. And I didn't think that it added to the novel. I think that it actively ruined the rest of the novel for me. So I was pissed, needless to say. So yeah, unfortunate, especially given the fact that I had been anticipating this book for quite a while. Okay, moving right along into much better territory, we have my second graphic novel of the month, St. Catherine by Anna Mayer. So I saw this one kind of randomly while I was traveling after I read Simplicity, and I thought I would just try to get it when I got home or whatnot, but I saw that it was available at Barnes & Noble when I was traveling, and I went and bought it because it just sounded so perfect. And yeah, I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. I'm gonna recommend it to everybody now. Basically, short synopsis, it follows Catherine, who is 25 and who has been Catholic all her life and never skipped mass, and she skips mass one day to hang out with her boyfriend. They go to this like old abandoned, broken down church, and after that she becomes possessed by a demon who is basically a physical manifestation of guilt and shame associated with religion. All that to say, very much up my alley. I was never Catholic, but the religious deconstruction vibes are strong with this one, and I really, really liked that. I think the art style is really cool. I really liked the kind of play with color and then sometimes kind of a black and white vibe, or like kind of grayscale vibe like these ones. This page in particular had me tearing up. I was reading this on my plane ride back, and it took me like an hour and a half to read, but just the image of her hugging her younger self had me tearing up. It's such a beautiful book also, like the art and the cover and everything are so pretty. The end papers, everything about this book is so pretty. I really, really loved it. Spoiler, I think that this ended up being my favorite book of August. So highly, highly recommend this one if you're at all into graphic novels. This is a great addition to my graphic novel collection. Okay, the next book I want to talk about is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. I read this also with my best friend as a buddy read, and I think that Joan Didion is a fabulous writer. I think that her style is beautiful and well thought out. It's no surprise why she is as beloved as she is. I was told to start with this one, and I'm glad that I did. I think that it was a fantastic example of her writing and deeply, deeply moved me. I don't know that reading this book makes me want to continue reading Didion because it did have a very strong emotional impact on me, and I don't know if I'm ready to dive back into her style of writing. It is very heavy and very difficult to read as someone who struggles with the fear of being left behind. I think we all do in some ways, so like I'm not unique in that, but hearing about her husband's death and the suddenness of it and all of the small and seemingly insignificant ways that she feels his loss and how they add up to being so all-encompassing. It was really hard to read and hard to hear as somebody, like I said, who is afraid of being left behind and being the one who lives on. There's a lot of fear associated with that, I think, for a lot of people, and so it hit home for me. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic book and beautifully done. I just don't know that I'm ready to dive back into Didion's writing, so I gave that one 4 stars. On a very different note, we have Perfume and Pain by Anna Dorn. This one is sapphic and has to do a lot with obsession and queer relationships, and so this one I also gave 3 stars. I do think that it was an interesting novel and I had fun reading it, but it's not overly memorable and I don't think that I would ever come back to it. So 3 stars. Okay, next we have Annie Bot by Sierra Greer. So I was very pleasantly surprised at how much I liked this one. I thought I would like it just given the fact that one of my close friends recommended it to me and really liked it. However, I had also heard from another friend that they didn't like the ending, so I wasn't sure how I would feel about it. But wow, I really, really liked this book. I found it to be very thought-provoking. I haven't read anything to do with robots or AI or anything like that in a while. I went through a phase when I read Clara and the Sun where I really fell in love with those topics, specifically how it has to do with themes of autonomy and what it means to be human, and also hearing about women's issues through the lens of like AI and robots, and sort of the idea of women's bodies being objectified and used to even more degrees than human bodies. So really, really interesting in terms of the thematic elements, but I got really invested in that topic and tried to read other books like it after I read Clara and the Sun, and then I got kind of burnt out. So reading Annie Bot has kind of re-sparked the interest, and now I'm kind of on this trajectory of finding more books that explore those topics. I think that there are quite a few more now than there were when I started reading them. So I'm interested to continue reading books on this topic, and reading this also inspired me to start watching Westworld, so my husband and I have been watching that. So I really do think about this often, and I gave it 4 stars initially, but it's kind of one of those books that you might come back to later and bump up the rating. I'm not sure, just given how much I think about it. I think that happens sometimes where if a book doesn't feel like an immediate 5-star read, but if I think about it a lot over time and come back to it repeatedly in my mind, or if I reread it at some point, it kind of makes me want to bump it to 5 stars, because I read a lot of books that I give 4 stars and I don't think about them very much. And to me, a 5-star read is just one that you come back to frequently and think about. So yeah, it's one of those that may get bumped up to 5 stars. But next up, I do have an actual 5-star read, and that is Open Wide by Jessica Gross. This was one of my most anticipated books of this year after reading Hysteria and loving it and following along with this author, keeping up with what she's writing, what she's doing. And yeah, I was not disappointed. This book is crazy. It is wild. It is weird. It's much more involved than her previous book, in the sense that the scope of the book is smaller and that it takes place over a briefer period of time. So this one is a little bit more involved and takes place over a longer period of time. And like I said, it's also a bit longer. So yeah, I was quite impressed with this, but that was no surprise. As much as I love Hysteria, I knew I was really gonna like this, and her style is just so weird and trippy, and I just really like it. So yeah, this book definitely confirmed my obsession with this author, and I will absolutely be reading anything that this woman publishes. I think she's fantastic. Okay, only a couple books left because I didn't read as many books in August as I did in July, but this one was a little bit disappointing also, and it was hard copy by Fien Veldman. This was a translated book, and I was expecting it to be kind of like Sky Daddy, in that it is about a woman who falls in love with an inanimate object, and I was expecting it to get really weird, and it just didn't. It was much more about corporate culture and the grind. It was more about capitalism and critiquing those things, and it was much quieter and more thoughtful. Like, she was just more in her head and thinking about these issues rather than actually acting and doing anything weird. And yeah, I mean, maybe if this hadn't been pitched as a weird girl falls in love with printer book, I would have had a better expectation. I think that it fell victim to that, like, this is a weird woman book kind of thing, like Blob did for me when I read that one. It's pitched as this weird book where there's this weird love story and something strange happens, and you're expecting it to get kind of like explicit in that. But in reality, it's just a little bit more pensive and subtle and quiet, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just when you build something up in a way that you expect it to be really weird, especially off the heels of things like Sky Daddy and Chlorine and things like that, where, yeah, it's really weird. I'm expecting a lot from the book when I read it, and it just did not deliver. It was not weird whatsoever. It was kind of boring. Pivoting to a weirder book, this is What Hunger by Catherine Dang. So on Goodreads it says 4 stars. I do think that I'm gonna bump this to 5 stars because I keep thinking about it, and I ended up buying a copy after the fact. So again, that tells me that I really liked the book. It is a cannibal girlhood horror book. Can you sense a theme in my recent reads? It also explores the Asian American experience and covers family trauma and assault, and how traumas can kind of compound the real life horrors of girlhood, and how all of these collective traumas can result in some horrifying stuff. I really love this subsection of literature right now and the ways that different authors are exploring this subject matter. This was a recent release as well, and I was lucky enough to get an audiobook, but loved it so much that I ended up purchasing it. So yeah, that is What Hunger. Okay, yet another book for a TBR takedown. This one is Girls of a Certain Age by Maria Adelman. This one was not super disappointing or super exciting. It was a 3-star read. It is a short story collection, and like I said before, with these type of collections, it is very easy for it to be kind of a 3-star read because there are just as many stories I liked as stories I disliked. I did highlight some things in here, and I did rate each one of the stories with their separate star ratings, which helps me kind of come up with what my ultimate star rating is going to be. There were a couple of 5-star reads, 1 4-star read, and the rest were 2, 3, and 1-star reads. So I have an easier time with giving short stories 1 stars within the collection. But overall, I do think that it was interesting covering the themes of girlhood and womanhood and the different ways that women are disempowered, I believe was the phrasing from the Dust Jacket. So in that, it does talk quite a bit about men, because men are typically doing the disempowering. I've heard some people kind of have issues with how much men feature in the book, but I didn't find that to be overly annoying. I think that more so, it was just that some hit home for me and some didn't, so it ended up being a 3-star. Okay, 2 more books to talk about, the first of which is Make Me Famous by Maud Ventura. So this was another new release that I got my hands on. I loved Maud Ventura's first book, and I read it early in this year, so I was really excited about Make Me Famous, and I ended up buying it kind of on a whim, because I thought about buying it, and then I was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get to this super soon, so I didn't, and then I was traveling and I ended up buying it. However, I didn't feel like it was super easy to get into this book. I was trying to physically read it and I was really struggling. So, funny story, I ended up going to return it because it was still within the 30-day window for Barnes & Noble. So I returned it and bought the audiobook. So I ended up getting to listen to it, which was much better for me. Like I was saying, like sometimes audiobooks don't work and sometimes they work better for certain things. And for this situation, I had such an easier time falling into this character and her way of thinking and the writing style with the audiobook. When I was physically reading it didn't really pick up until like 30% of the way through anyway. So I was kind of struggling with that opening part of the book that wasn't super gripping. But then as it progressed, it was very gripping. So I'm kind of in between 3 and 4 stars for this one. I think that the twist was really good. I think that her voice was really interesting, and hearing about a woman who is power hungry and just has this inflated ego. I don't feel like a lot of Weird Women books cover that subject. I think a lot of times the women are more self-deprecating and more like, I'm horrible. Sometimes they're kind of proud, but this was a little bit more unique in the perspective of a woman who just knows she's going to be famous and has all this confidence. Yeah, it was just a really interesting and unique voice. So I'm between 3 and 4 stars for this one. Maybe like a 3.5 if I could do that on Goodreads, but for the sake of my channel, I can give it a 3.5. And then lastly, unfortunately not ending on a super high note, I have Ask Me Again by Claire Sustanovich. So this was a book club book for my book club in Tulsa that I go to every month, and this was the August pick. And I was not alone in thinking that this wasn't a great book. A lot of people also agreed with me. I don't know that there is like a ton specifically to say about that. I did give it 2 stars. I just found it to be lacking in direction, lacking in plot, lacking in central ideas and themes. I didn't think the characters were that well put together or fleshed out. I don't think that it was overly well written. There were some kind of pretentious leanings, which normally I don't have a problem with. I also normally don't have a problem with character-focused stories. However, the character was not interesting, and that kind of changes my thoughts on character-focused stories. If it's going to lack plot points that I can really hang on to, it needs to be a character that I really like or really hate, something like that, like something that I can hang on to. But this felt like it was just like floating along and there wasn't anything to like anchor it. And I'm not somebody who's like a plot focused person. Like I'm fine with lots of kind of self-reflection, lots of character focused stuff. Like I'm totally cool with that, but it does have to be a character that I like. Unfortunately, none of the characters in this book were overly likable or overly interesting. They were all just kind of floating along and they didn't really have strong opinions or thoughts. So just a little bit unfortunate and a little bit disappointing. But honestly, when I went into this, I wasn't really expecting to love it just because the premise didn't sound overly exciting, but I knew I was going to read it for book club. So I'm still glad I read it for that purpose, but not my favorite. Okay, so those are all the books I read in July and August. Thank you for sticking around if you got to this point in this kind of chatty, chill video. I just wanted to share these books with you, and unfortunately, they were not all amazing in the past 2 months. I definitely have had better reading months this year, but there were some really great standout books as well. So it's kind of fun to share those with you, and also a little bit fun to rant about the books I don't like. So yeah, that is the wrap up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.